Call this meeting to order. Good morning and welcome to Open Caucus. I'm Art Eggleton, Senator from Toronto. Beside me is my co-chair, Senator Raymond Saint-Germain from Quebec. The Open Caucus is a forum for discussion on issues of national importance. The meeting is co-sponsored by the Independent Senators Group, ISG, the Independent Senate Liberals, and the Government Representative Office in the Senate. It's a non-partisan discussion. It's open to all parliamentarians, MPs and senators, staff and media, and the public. According to 2017 Correctional Investigators Report, women, particularly Indigenous women, are the fastest growing population in Canadian prisons. Specifically, the total number of female prisoners has increased by 30% in the last 10 years. The number of Indigenous female prisoners has increased by over 60% in that same period. One of the many challenges of managing this growing population may be security classifications, because this was outlined in the 2017 Auditor General report, saying that the security classification of female prisoners is determined by an outdated model, and it's designed to assess men, not women. With the aim of successful reintegration in the community, we ask what measures can be taken to mitigate the risk of inappropriate classifications or any other impediments that may exist. What type of judicial oversight might be needed to ensure that this process is monitored and decision makers are held accountable? So that's the topic. Now, a couple things on logistics. As you may have noticed already, there's coffee and tea at the back of the room. Please help yourself. And particularly I want to mention for the audience, the people in front of me, translation is available. You can use the headsets located at your chair. I'm told that channel 12 is for the floor microphones. Channel 13 is English, channel 14 is French, and there's a blue button, I think, there that is for volume. Now, mentioning the audience, let me also say we encourage audience participation. That's what microphone number 5 is, in the middle of the floor. And if you'd like to make a comment or a question, we can give you up to 3 minutes each. Just let our coordinator, our Open Caucus coordinator, Sarah, wave, there's Sarah, okay. Just let her know. We'll get your name and any affiliation that you might have down, and then we'll work it in as best we can. So with that, I'll turn it over and make a few words from my co-chair en français.
Merci, Monsieur le co-président, le vice-président. Distingués collègues, membres de l'auditoire, ce matin, nous allons parler beaucoup de la population carcérale, particulièrement des femmes autochtones incarcérées au niveau fédéral, mais aussi, c'est important d'avoir conscience qu'au niveau provincial, partout au Canada, c'est la même situation. Lorsque j'étais protectrice du citoyen du Québec en 2016, j'ai eu l'occasion de présenter à l'Assemblée nationale un rapport spécial qui a été intitulé « Les conditions de détention, l'administration de la justice et la prévention de la criminalité au Nunavik », tous des aspects liés, détention, justice, prévention de la criminalité. L'enquête qui a mené à ce rapport a notamment révélé que les femmes inuites de l'établissement de détention de la maison Tanguay à Montréal, aujourd'hui Maison Leclerc, qui ne parlent pas français, ne pouvaient pas accéder au plateau de travail de la buanderie. Ça peut sembler anodin. Ce que ça veut dire, c'est pas de cohabitation, pas d'échange avec les autres détenus, pas de petite allocation financière, donc pour préparer la transition, et pas de formation pour éventuellement pouvoir intégrer le marché du travail. Alors, j'ai fait un rapport spécial qui a recommandé au ministère de la Sécurité publique de prendre des moyens pour que l'accès au plateau de travail soit le même pour les Inuits ayant un classement et que pour l'ensemble de la population carcérale. Et quand je dis classement, ça pouvait vouloir dire aussi classé dans un secteur à sécurité maximale. Et il y a eu un plan d'action conjoint depuis des ministères de la Sécurité publique et de la Justice du Québec, mais il reste énormément de travail à faire, tant au niveau provincial que fédéral. À ce sujet, les statistiques démontrent que les femmes issues des Premières Nations sont surreprésentées au sein de la population carcérale. Bien que les femmes autochtones ne forment que 4,3 % de la population au Canada, Elle compte pour 37 de l'ensemble des femmes détenues et 50 des femmes dans les établissements à sécurité maximale. Et je tiens à souligner que des problèmes de communication, non seulement linguistiques, mais culturels, contribuent à cette surreprésentation, notamment dans les établissements à sécurité maximale. Alors, l'une des responsabilités fondamentales que nous avons comme sénateurs, c'est de protéger les droits des minorités. Je considère qu'il est de notre devoir de nous assurer que notre discussion aujourd'hui ne se terminera pas à 11h15, mais plutôt qu'elle continuera d'alimenter une discussion et des gestes concrets qui entraîneront des transformations durables au sein du système correctionnel canadien. Pour ceux d'entre vous qui utilisez les services d'interprétariat, le canal 14 est celui du français et le bouton de volume est le bouton bleu. Merci à nos panélistes maintenant. J'ai le plaisir de présenter Howard Sapers, l'ancien enquêteur correctionnel du Canada que j'ai connu lorsque j'étais protectrice du citoyen. Je tiens à souligner que dans l'ensemble du Canada et auprès de tous les ombudsman correctionnels des provinces, il a joué un rôle de leadership remarquable et il a éveillé l'attention de plusieurs d'entre nous et de plusieurs gouvernements sur la situation correctionnelle au Canada, en particulier la situation des femmes et des femmes des Premières Nations. À ce titre, donc, d'ombudsman correctionnel, il présentait chaque année au Parlement des recommandations pour améliorer les services correctionnels au Canada et sa voix portait. Il est actuellement conseiller indépendant. Il a toujours été indépendant, depuis que je le connais en tout cas, sur la réforme des services correctionnels, donc conseiller auprès du gouvernement de l'Ontario. Alors, à vous, Howard.
Thank you, Senator Saint-Germain, Senator Eglinton. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's actually a remarkable opportunity to have a profound discussion about this issue. And it's a very important issue, and it doesn't get the attention that it deserves. Women don't overwhelm the corrections system in terms of their numbers, but the challenges are often much more complex when we're talking with women who are incompetent with the law and then find themselves incarcerated. So thank you for organizing this session. I will keep my remarks short. I know that'll come as a surprise. And I'll operate within the 7 minutes. And there's already been a fair introduction to some of the high-level challenges and concerns, the overrepresentation rates, the particular impact on Indigenous women and families, the fact that marginalized people are captured on a disproportionate level in our system is really no surprise. But the way that that those numbers are getting even more skewed is disturbing. Indigenous women continue to be overrepresented. 40% of admissions to all federal and provincial institutions in 2015 were First Nations, Inuit, and Métis women. And the rates of incarceration have grown in all forms of incarceration. So we usually think about perhaps those that are sent to federal penitentiaries, but this overrepresentation and the growth in the representation rate is happening in provincial custody as well, both including pretrial or remand custody and sentence custody. The greatest change, though, continues to be, the fastest rate of growth continues to be those who are receiving a sentence. And so I often challenge people. I said, well, does this mean that there is a crime wave being committed by women in Canada? And most people find that to be a preposterous question. So if that's not the case, then how do we explain this growth? There's lots of answers to that, I think. One of them is that it's policy-driven. Over the previous decade, for example, the Corrections and Conditional Release Act was amended to make public safety the preeminent purpose of the federal correctional system. That sounds okay, but in so doing, other equally important goals of corrections, such as offender rehabilitation or community reintegration, were downgraded or displaced entirely. The nature and gravity of the offense and the degree of responsibility of the offender, principles that were usually reserved for sentencing, were in fact added to the correctional law, becoming the new touchstones for how a sentence of imprisonment was to be administered. And this has implications for access to programs and security classification and eligibility for release, etc. There's little doubt that this policy agenda had a disproportionate effect on the disadvantaged and vulnerable amongst us in Canadian society. Between 2005 and 2015, the federal inmate population grew by 10%, even though crime rates fell in each of those 10 years. Much of this growth came from steady increases in admissions from Indigenous people, visible minorities, and mentally ill and addicted men and women. Over this period, the Indigenous population grew by 50% generally, but the number of Indigenous women in federal custody actually doubled. Even the briefest stay in custody can result in a range of collateral consequences that include the loss of employment, loss of housing, missed medication, missed medical follow-up, and the need for emergency care and intervention for dependents. These consequences are compounded for women, who are often the primary provider for children or for elderly parents. Minor adjustments to the system, such as having a more robust intake process for women, would mean that corrections could better support individuals from the moment they come into custody. This could include identifying urgent child care needs, medication requirements, housing supports, employment supports, the need for personal identification, or identifying clothing and transportation needs. Incarcerated women, although constituting a small number of admissions to custody, typically have complex needs. Research has demonstrated that women in custody are more likely to have been victims of physical and sexual abuse, experienced a history of psychiatric problems and treatment, have personal histories of trauma, including attempted suicide, and have issues often with various forms of substance misuse. Unfortunately, individualized case management while incarcerated is the exception for women, not the norm. For the majority of provincially incarcerated individuals, for example in Ontario, the institutional intake and admission process captures only the most basic personal information. Healthcare screening has its own distinct process and is often experiences many gaps. It is vital, especially for women, that any identified existing medication needs, for example, an immediate risk of self-harm or suicide, are appropriately triaged, managed, and prioritized during intake, given that women have more likely experienced this kind of trauma prior to their incarceration. We must more urgently and seriously explore better mental health and addiction screening and treatment for those in custody who have complex needs. Compounding the challenges of treatment, rehabilitation, and reintegration is the fact that correctional classification tools used on women are inadequate, especially for those used in regard to Indigenous women. In Ontario, the absence of evidence-based security classification tools has meant that compared to their non-Indigenous counterparts, Indigenous women are more likely to be classified as maximum security and more likely to be admitted to administrative segregation. The last time I heard that, it was locked down for about 3 hours, so it just makes me a little uncomfortable. Indigenous women are more likely to be classified as maximum security and more likely to be admitted to administrative segregation. The absence of gender and culturally informed evidence-based security risk assessment tools means that in Ontario, most institutional placement is determined by a variety of subjective factors. This can include placements during previous periods of incarceration, the individual officer's observations, or just their own impressions on the brief intake assessment. Although risk needs assessments are evidence-based tools used to get a rough measure of an individual's likelihood to reoffend, arguments have been made that these risk assessment tools are gender and culturally biased, and that when applied to Indigenous inmates, particularly women, they result in a higher score and thereby impacting classification, access to programming, and release eligibility. In fact, research has demonstrated that For First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women, when compared to their non-Indigenous counterparts, they serve a higher proportion of their sentence prior to first release, are more likely to be released only on statutory release, are more likely to be revoked and returned to custody, are more likely to be considered a high risk and high need, and are more likely to be classified as having low reintegration potential. Access to gender-specific programs results in additional barriers. Institutions that house less than 30 women, for example in the provinces and territories, have little capacity to provide women-centered programs and services. In Ontario, there is only one provincial correctional institution that houses more than 30 women, and that's the Vanier Centre for Women in the Greater Toronto Area. Ontario has no mother-child programs, limited prenatal and postpartum support, and inadequate policy about issues as basic as breastfeeding. The reality is that the vast majority of incarcerated mothers must interact with their children through closed visits, separated by plexiglass, and rarely for more than 40 minutes per week. For many parents whose children live in faraway communities, contacts are even less frequent or non-existent, a circumstance that disproportionately impacts Indigenous people. Women who give birth while provincially incarcerated will be separated from their newborns as soon as medically cleared. Some women report having been returned to custody within 6 hours of birth. These women are at an increased risk of postpartum depression and having been separated from their babies, yet institutional staff report that some new mothers will refrain from crying or even expressing sadness for fear of being placed in segregation or on suicide watch. Simply put, we need to find more ways to incarcerate fewer women, and for those women who are incarcerated, we need to provide better supports and services. Before I end, just a quick word about oversight. Although court oversight is one mechanism to try to overcome some of these injustices, it's a narrow option, I believe. Use of the courts for this function is often expensive, slow, and access is uneven. Additionally, once in the care of corrections, absent a judicial order, the courts have little say over day-to-day operational issues inside prisons and jails. Based on my experience, what may yield better results is the creation of multiple cascading levels and forms of oversight within the criminal justice system generally and in corrections particularly. I'd be happy to elaborate on any of these points during our questions. Thank you once again for the opportunity to be here and participate in this discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Sapers, and thank you for your continuing involvement post-Correctional Investigator of Canada position, your continuing advisory role, your monitoring role, and your interest in this matter. Our next panelist is Dr. Pam Palmater. She's a member of the Eel River Bar First Nation, which is part of the Mi'kmaq Nation. She's been practicing lawyer for 20 years and focuses on Indigenous law, human rights, and the rights of Indigenous women and girls. She currently holds the position of Chair in Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University in Toronto. Welcome.
Thank you. Kwe Nindaluizi Pam Palmater. I'm from the Sovereign Mi'kmaq Nation, and I want to acknowledge that we are on sovereign Algonquin territory, having this really important discussion, and I really appreciate being asked to speak and to sit on a panel with people that I admire, like Howard Sapers and Kim and other experts. It's an important topic that does not get enough attention because it is about prison and people that have been imprisoned. So the most important part that I would like to make is that this issue doesn't start with prison or incarceration or even police officers. This is an issue, a crisis that Canada created and that Canada maintains. And my focus will be on prevention. But it's important to know who it is that we're talking about. And my focus is on Indigenous women and little girls, because these Indigenous women hold really important roles in our nations. They're leaders, they're warriors, they're political strategists, they're negotiators, they're interpreters, they're life givers. They're literally the soul of our nations. So when Canada imprisons Indigenous women, they're literally imprisoning our nations. And we've had enough of a struggle with colonization as it is. But the other thing is that this is a culmination of events, of laws and policies. Canada has always targeted Indigenous women for dispossession, and oppression to keep our nations down. From the very first police forces in this country that worked with Indian agents to extort sex from Indigenous women and little girls by using food rations, to residential schools, the theft of our children, where they were physically, sexually abused, and many of them died, to stealing our children during the 60s scoop, and the Indian Act, which today continues to discriminate against Indigenous women, and it shows Canadians that it is legal to discriminate against Indigenous women. And all of this has led not just to a historical legacy, an intergenerational trauma and the effects that we see today, but it's ongoing. And that is part of the problem. We have so many problems in Canada that its dark history, literally, of racism and oppression and dispossession of our lands and resources, separation from our nations and our families, and ongoing sexualized violence against Indigenous women and girls continues into the present day, which creates the social conditions which fuels conflict with the law, none of which is the responsibility of Indigenous nations. And that is part of the problem. The socioeconomic conditions of Indigenous women and girls in this country act like a pipeline to murder to missing, a pipeline to foster care, a pipeline to prison, and all of those are also self-reinforcing. So if you find yourself in foster care, you're more likely to find yourself in prison or in conflict with the law. In First Nations, women have to deal with the lack of access to the basics like clean drinking water. There's high levels of food insecurity. Almost 20% of houses are not safe for human habitation and should be condemned. And that doesn't even take into account almost 50% that are in need of major repair. But of all of the homeless people in this country, 40% are Indigenous peoples. And the majority of those are Indigenous women. Some of them also their children and babies. They have a less of a lifespan than regular Canadians, upwards of 15 years, and at a time when rates of chronic disease and heart attack and stroke seem to be on the decline. For Indigenous women particularly, they have the highest rates in the country. 28-year gap in education, 60-year gap in income. It should be no surprise that Indigenous women and children suffer from higher rates of poverty. In First Nations, the rates are 60%. But if you look at specific provinces where there are higher levels of poverty, in Manitoba, for example, 76%. And those are disproportionately headed by single Indigenous moms. And because of that poverty, we have the highest rates of foster care. Half of all Indigenous kids, all foster kids in Canada, literally are part of the foster care system primarily from conditions of poverty. So all of these things are self-reinforcing, and if you look at the socioeconomic statistics of all of the women who have gone murdered and missing, they share all of these same characteristics. And all of those same characteristics are also shared by Indigenous women in prison. They are more likely, more than 90% of Indigenous women in prison have suffered physical and or sexual abuse. They have had about 1/5 of them come from residential schools. 2/3 of Indigenous peoples in prison come from the foster care system. And right now, Indigenous girls are the highest rate of those being entered into youth corrections, and about 40% of them come from the foster care system. So if we don't act on prevention and we only focus on systems within prisons, and that's important, then we're not going to stem the flow, and it's going to keep increasing. This crisis obviously is nothing new. We have a scenario where the over-incarceration of Indigenous women and girls doesn't just steal years from these Indigenous women's lives and time with their families, but it results in reduced life chances, less education, less likelihood to get a job, a higher risk of homelessness, a higher risk of actually being murdered and missing or engaging in precarious or risky work, and a higher chance of reoffending because of the lack of community supports. But within prison, it also creates a higher risk of physical and sexual injuries to these women. in solitary, they have subjected to solitary or administrative segregation. They have longer stays in segregation. They make up 50% of all of those placed in solitary confinement. Indigenous peoples represent 22% of all the deaths in prison. So there are many reasons why we need to prevent, in addition to programs. My recommendations focus on addressing these socioeconomic conditions, providing stable funding and legal supports for First Nation justice institutes and healing and community mechanisms, ensuring that there's a formal and independent review of both justice and corrections officials with regards to sexual assaults, physical assaults, and any kind of inappropriate behavior in prison, and also specifically to end the practice of segregation and to end the practice of employing male staff working in prisons.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Perlmutter. J'ai le plaisir maintenant de vous présenter Jennifer Kilty, qui est professeure agrégée et directrice associée du département de criminologie de l'Université d'Ottawa. Elle a mené un grand nombre de recherches et rédigé de nombreuses publications sur les pratiques d'isolement en milieu carcéral et la fabrication sociale de filles et de femmes dangereuses. Elle a récemment terminé d'enseigner le tout premier cours Walls to Bridges de l'Université d'Ottawa au centre de détention d'Ottawa Caucuin. Alors, c'est avec beaucoup d'intérêt qu'on va vous écouter.
Merci beaucoup. I want to begin by acknowledging that we do this work today on unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And it's an honor and privilege to be here today, and I'd like to thank Senator Eggleton for inviting me to speak and for the Senate Open Caucus for organizing this panel on women in prison. I thank you for your time and your energy in organizing and in conducting this incredibly important work. I'd also like to thank my colleagues Vicky Chartrand and Deborah Parks for their consultation on the issues that we're discussing here today. So in 2016, Maclean's magazine published an article entitled "Canada's Prisons Are the New Residential Schools." This statement exposes how our criminal justice system consistently works against Indigenous peoples during police checks and arrests, bail and detention, sentencing, and of course the disproportionately high rates of imprisonment that Indigenous people experience. These trends are also well documented in other settler colonial societies, including the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, so it's not unique to Canada. This reality and this dark legacy of settler colonialism shows that Indigenous women are disproportionately more likely to be criminalized and imprisoned for what are commonly referred to as crimes of survival. And any attempt to reform correctional practices requires considering how criminalization and colonialism are interconnected systems of oppression. One way that Canadian prisons unreasonably punishes both women and Indigenous peoples is through the overestimation of risk that they're assessed as posing to themselves, to prison staff, and to other prisoners. As the Auditor General's report found, not only has the Correctional Service of Canada been using the custody rating scale to determine women's initial security placement, which is a tool that was created over 25 years ago based on data collected from a sample of male prisoners, they also frequently override scores in order to house women in higher levels of security. Research demonstrates that actuarial tools tend to overestimate risk. They prioritize static rather than dynamic factors, which means it's very difficult for a woman's risk level to shift. And they often interpret women's needs as being potential risk factors. By equating women's needs with risk, it means that they're going to spend more time in prison, even though this isn't necessary for public safety in the vast majority of cases. As a result, women, especially Indigenous women, are disproportionately subject to some of the most restrictive penal practices and forms of punishment that we offer, including maximum security segregation classifications, segregation, involuntary transfers, physical restraints, strip searches, uses of force, dry cells, and institutional charges for minor things that can significantly extend the length of time they spend incarcerated. Overestimating women's risk and security classification has a direct impact on women's ability to access correctional rehabilitational programming, so much so that women are frequently denied parole because they haven't completed their correctional programming in a timely manner. This means that some women spend years in prison before ever accessing rehabilitational programs. Knowing this, it's unsurprising that women experience significantly higher rates of self-injurious behavior while incarcerated. Self-harm is a coping strategy that's cultivated in response to the carceral environment, and it's compounded by histories of abuse and trauma. Unfortunately, because women's resistance and their inability to adjust and cope in prison is interpreted as a form of non-compliance or is perceived as a security threat, these actions are typically met with the spontaneous use of force, institutional charges, and time and segregation. So we can see the damaging impact that these institutional charges, segregation, and inappropriate security classifications have on federally sentenced women when we hear and we remember the names of Kinu James, Renee Akobe, and Ashley Smith. We think of these as anomalous cases, but the treatment that these women experience is actually very common and happens every day in prisons across this country. So when we start to think about what measures can be taken to mitigate the risk of inappropriate classification, there are a number of things that I think we can do. First, we need to recognize that a one-size-fits-all approach runs counter to the imperative of recognizing cultural, racial, gendered, class, and sexual diversity that is at the core of a multicultural Canadian identity and that aims to respect our Charter-protected human rights, freedoms, and dignity. One thing that we know for sure is that we cannot just add in women to existing models and approaches that have been created based on research conducted on men. It's not enough to create a women's version of an existing security classification protocol or model. Instead, we need to realize and address women in a completely different way. Women are not just different from men, they're different from each other. And I think that something that tends to get lost in efforts to recognize the needs of Indigenous women is that they do not all share the same cultural backgrounds, values, or practices. As Patricia Montour once said, Indigenous women are viewed with a pan-Indigenous lens that fails to recognize the diversity across Indigenous groups. The same can be said for Black and Asian women. Lumping diverse groups of women together universalizes their risks, their needs, and their experiences. So because women rarely require maximum security classification, which is detrimental to their well-being and their rehabilitation, I echo Dr. Moira Law's and the Task Force on Federally Sentenced Women's recommendation that all women begin their incarceration as minimum security classification, and that they may only be escalated to a medium or maximum security as a result of behavior that actually warrants that level of security. We need to work to minimize the harmful impacts of the prison, including abolishing the use of segregation for women in prison. Isolation only adds to mental distress, and women are not able to access programming while in maximum security or in segregation. It's my understanding that CAFES, the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, has a pilot alternative to segregation that, in place that favors the consideration of dynamic security measures. The government also needs to work more toward an economically responsible decarceration strategy that would rely on community-based alternatives to confinement. There are options in our existing legislation, including Section 29 agreement for mental health care in the community and Section 81 to 84 provisions that encourage certain prisoners to be able to serve their sentence and their parole in a supported way in the community. We also have to remember Section 718 of the Criminal Code, known as the Gladue Principle, which allows us to consider the role that Indigenous people's social context plays in their criminalization. Unfortunately, most Indigenous women do not benefit from Section 718, as these factors are often used against them in the context of risk assessment, decisions made for bail, sentencing, correctional planning, security classification, and parole. The fact that Indigenous women have often experienced extreme trauma, poverty, substance use, and other forms of marginalization is often used as evidence that they need more correctional intervention and therefore more time in prison. This is something that needs to change. A community-based decarceration strategy would also involve allowing community representatives to deliver programs and services, which would strengthen community ties and would aid women upon their release. We also need to work toward eliminating mandatory minimum sentences in order to reduce the number of women and men in prison. Echoing the kinds of recommendations that have been made over the years by the Task Force on Federally Sentenced Women, Justice Arbour, and the coroner's inquiry into Ashley Smith's death, there needs to be external, independent oversight and accountability. This can occur by way of judicial review, as outlined by Justice Arbour, or parliamentary oversight, as outlined by Senator Kim Pate. I also suggest that it's a conflict of interest for the Correctional Service of Canada to conduct all of their internal evaluation research on their programs and classification tools. Ethically, external researchers should be contracted to conduct evaluation research, which would operate as a mechanism of external oversight. Finally, I think that because external researchers, academics, and the media are so frequently denied access to our prisons and penitentiaries, that we should be very concerned about the lack of transparency and the lack of access to these public institutions. I would say that incarcerated people and even correctional staff should have the right to freely speak to outside researchers and academics about their experiences in federal institutions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. You've given numerous recommendations. We would that's good. I'd appreciate it if we could get a copy in writing. In fact, I'll say that for any of our panelists who want to give anything in writing for follow-up purposes, it's helpful to have that. So thank you very much. Well, our fourth panelist is one of us. Doesn't happen too often that a senator is part of our panel. We have had senators before, and we've also had Senator Pate before. But before she was a senator, she was here as one of the expert panelists on a related issue a couple of years ago or so. But she's here today as a panelist because she has a lot of knowledge, a lot of passion and commitment to these issues. She, prior to becoming a senator, was executive director of the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies. She's also a nationally renowned advocate who has spent the last 35 years working in and around legal and penal systems of Canada with and on behalf of some of the most marginalized people in our population. She's an educator, a teacher by background, and also a lawyer. So welcome to a different part of the table, Senator Pate.
Yes. Thank you very much, Senator Eggleton, and thank you to both of you for chairing and to all of you for being here and all of you for being here as well. I also want to acknowledge we're on the unceded, as uninvited guests on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people, and I thank all of the ancestors and the future generations who take care of the land. I also want to thank particularly all of the individuals who inform what I'm about to speak about, because it's the women inside, and before that the men and young people, but the women inside, many of whom called me over the weekend or sent me messages as I had put out a message that this was happening and what they thought needed to be said. So I want to thank them, because it's those women and their experiences that I have the privilege and responsibility of speaking about. And I also want to thank the Senate for doing these open caucuses, because in fact it was an open caucus like this that led to the idea that now Senator Bernard, as chair of the Human Rights Committee, and Senator Cordy, as vice chair, are overseeing, which is the human rights review of the situation in prisons right now across the country, and is part of a review that's ongoing. And it was an idea that was generated out of one of these open caucus meetings. So it's a really good example of how important they are. Because so much of the factual pieces have been covered of who's in prison, and when we talk about women, I want to talk, and as well how to prevent some of it, from Dr. Palmater, and some of the potential ideas from both Mr. Sapers and Dr. Kilty. I'd like to talk a bit about, to pick up on what Howard talked about, which was the issue that these are policy decisions. So these are policy decisions made by governments, and actually all of you said, so not just Howard, but these are policy decisions historically made that have led to an increasing use and reliance and norming of crime and punishment in this country in a way that really mirrors and follows a lot of what's happened in the United States because of our proximity. And it means that we are doing things that have put us on a trajectory that is not impossible to get off, but requires looking at all the intersecting areas. So when we talk about what contributes, we need to talk about, as we were yesterday in the Open Caucus on the Anti-Poverty Caucus, talk about how the economic realities feed this issue, and you heard about that. We know that the last time it was looked at, more than 80% of the people in custody were in essentially for trying to navigate life circumstances that start with impoverishment in many kinds of ways. We know about the racism and the fact that if you're overrepresented as being poor because you're racialized, because you're a woman, that exponentially increases it. We also heard from Dr. Palmater about the violence, the experiences of violence, And the reality is we know that if you then are encouraged to anesthetize yourself to that violence rather than to have those issues addressed, that can lead to issues of addiction, particularly with drugs and illegal substances, but also with legal substances that cause people to then be in situations where, again, they're trying to navigate an increasingly inhospitable world. So things like why we should be looking at things like guaranteed livable incomes, why we should be looking at supports in Indigenous communities and self-governance and nation-to-nation relationships, why we should not be just encouraging, for instance, First Nations communities, when we talk about self-governance, to import our models, so that many of us are talking in other spheres about decolonizing even the justice committees that are being developed on First Nations reserves as something that really just replicates the model. And when, even in education, of course we need to educate about our history in terms of Indigenous peoples, but think about the messages it sends when we talk about crime prevention instead of healthy communities. When we talk about the fact that we are funding things through crime prevention initiatives that really should be about fundamental human rights. So when we feed pregnant, I've often used the example when we have programs that are about feeding children in schools, and we call it crime prevention. We have programs that are about supporting pregnant teens, and we call it crime prevention. What we're essentially sending as a message is that we are actually doing those things to prevent the next crop of criminals. And I should put that in air quotes. And so those are messages we send by the way we develop policy. And I was struck many years ago when I was visited by somebody who came to visit from Europe at how shocked they were at how much criminal activities and crime shows dominated our media, and that the fact that we had all of that as what was norming how we think about it. Even think about how children talk about what you do. You know, if you're bad, you'll go to jail. If you're, all of the ways that we have normed this. So those are other pieces. So I think there are many facets to this, including and oftentimes I talk about the example of women being the fastest growing prison population, particularly Indigenous women and women with mental health issues, as symptomatic of the fact that we are settling for harm reduction models instead of equality, the equality models that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and our Human Rights Acts presume. So what does that mean? It means when you talk about a harm reduction model, you start to expand things like courts. So you have special circumstance courts, you have new programs in prisons, and one of the things I would recommend, and picking up on Jennifer's recommendation about programs and having outside people, one of the things we should be really looking at is why we haven't implemented the parts of legislation, as Jennifer pointed out, sections 29, 81, 81 of the corrections legislation now, that would allow, that was actually put in place, if you go back to Hansard, when my predecessors and our predecessors and parliamentarians were looking at the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, they were actually seeing it as a piece of human rights legislation that was aimed to reduce the numbers of people in prison. So that's back in the late 80s, early 90s. And when we see that it has been policy decisions to not implement those provisions, to limit the policies that Corrections has put in place, we can do something about that. Dr. Law's research was mentioned. After the Canadian Human Rights Commission found that the manner in which women are treated in the federal prison system is discriminatory, they hired a woman named Dr. Moira Law. She recommended, as did the task force before, as you pointed out, that in fact they start all women at a minimum security level because most women do not pose a risk to public safety. If they pose a risk, it's often greatest to themselves. And so that was not implemented. And too often we've really had an approach of, whether it's add women and stir or too few to count, there's all kinds of cliches that have been used to describe it. But really we have the opportunity to do things very differently. You mentioned the pilot. Actually, I'll back up. One of the challenges, and in terms of doing this work, when you talk about women, is there is the overarching shadow of what happens in men's prisons and what happens with men. And in the prisons for women, one of the one of the things that happens fairly quickly is the policies that are put in place for men are often replicated in the women's prisons. And one of the things Louise Arbour recommended when she did her what I still think of as the high watermark on reform recommendations, her Commission of Inquiry into the Prison for Women in Kingston, she recommended that corrections actually use women's corrections as the flagship to try every new progressive pilot, from decarcerating, using Section 81, 84, and Section 29 for mental health, but also to look at using new measures in terms of bringing community in and getting women out. And so those recommendations I still think carry the day. And at that time, when we had no limits on the use of administrative segregation, which we still don't, although there's a bill before Parliament, before the Senate right now, on before Parliament, sorry, on that point. One of the things she did was recommend some limits on the use of segregation. In the 20-some years since then, what she now recommends is that we actually eliminate the use of segregation for women. She's joined by the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, and the Ontario Human Rights Commission in that objective. And so what that means for women that many people don't realize is if a woman is classified as maximum security, she is in a state of segregation, a legal state of segregation, because she is in a separate unit, she's within a prison, federal penitentiary for women, within a separate fortified prison unit within there. And so she doesn't have access to the gymnasium except when she's escorted by officers, sometimes having to be strip searched in and out of there. So treated as though she's actually being transferred from one prison to another. How's that different for men? Well, men are usually in maximum security institutions and have all of those services available. So what does that mean, and why should we be looking at fundamentally different approaches? It means that we're talking about a situation where we have everybody agrees, historically, even, and aside from official positions that they have to uphold because of decisions taken by ministers, most people working within the bureaucracy of prisons will agree that women are not the people who are causing challenges usually. If they are, it tends to be disruptive behavior, as everybody now knows about from Ashley Smith, or a new inquest that's about to start, Terry Baker, or the one that Jennifer mentioned, Canoe James. It tends to be because they are responding to the exacerbation of the symptoms of their mental health condition that happen because of their conditions of confinement. So women tend to be held in more restrictive conditions. So one of the things we could be looking at is alleviating those conditions by, obviously, if not release, then at least by different approaches. And many people don't know that Section 81 of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act can be used to release people who are even classified as maximum security, who are serving life sentences, before any of their parole eligibility dates, if an agreement is negotiated between the Minister of Public Safety and a community. It's geared towards really reducing the number of Indigenous prisoners, but subsection of that legislation, of that provision, says it can apply to non-Indigenous prisoners as well. So it could be used for all kinds of populations, and tends to be not used. So who should we be emulating? Well, we could look to, oftentimes people say, well, who's doing it right? Well, in my opinion, Canada has the opportunity to be the leader in this area. Canada could be the one to say, we'll do it right. But let me give you some examples of where things are being done a bit differently. Many of you know who Nelson Mandela is. Probably not a lot of you know that Nelson Mandela, one of the first things he did as an act of Parliament when he became the president, was to release all the women in prison who were mothers who had children under the age of 12. Because after his own experience, his then wife's experience in prison, he knew that to separate a mother from children was to relegate generations to come to subjugation or to exacerbate that subjugation. So that's something we could be looking at. The Elizabeth Fry Society, as you mentioned, has recommended and offered to do a pilot to get every woman out of segregation. Corrections actually hasn't agreed to do that yet, but they have. And but individual wardens will sometimes call corrections, or individual staff will. The other thing that Elizabeth Fry has done is develop the human rights module are basically human rights handbooks for prisoners. And there are human rights advocacy teams that go on a monthly basis, go in through the entire institution to monitor the conditions of confinement. And even the correctional investigator, in my experience, and Howard can correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't go into segregation in the prisons for women as often as those teams do. And now those teams are also joined by members within. So the teams consist of people outside the prison who go in, Elizabeth Fry people, sometimes lawyers, sometimes former prisoners, as well as prisoners inside serving their sentence. And a case, you mentioned Renee Ackeby's case. Well, in fact, Renee is before the parole board as we speak. And one of the challenges that is faced, well, maybe not quite, sorry, in a few hours she'll be before the parole board. But one of the challenges that is really highlighted by how she's been treated is that right now, one of the things we have to deconstruct for this parole hearing, which is the second adjournment of a parole hearing for a woman who was labeled a dangerous offender based on everything that she did that caused them to label her a dangerous offender, happened in the prison. And so I'm just going to run through it a bit to cap this off. So she came into the prison. Her mother was murdered when she was 6 months old. She ended up in the care of family first and then in child welfare. Impacts of intergenerational residential school, as Pam has talked about, ended up in the prison system for a fairly short sentence, 3.5 years at first for drug trafficking, which is a serious, is an issue, but is also one of the few employment opportunities for many of some of the most marginalized in our country. Not to excuse that, but that's, and when she entered the prison, women at that time were being held, women classified, women coming into the prison, and all Indigenous women except one in the Prairie region were put into Saskatchewan Penitentiary, where our Aboriginal Peoples Committee just recently visited. And they were put in a segregated unit there, where the men had encouraged them, if you want to try and get programs, then one of the things you start to do is take hostages. And that process started in there. She was involved in a number of those hostage takings. Some of them staged, some of them not. She, as she started to accumulate her charges and sentences, those sentences, she eventually was labeled a dangerous offender, again, for everything that happened in the prison. And now, as the corrections finally got an outside psychologist and psychiatrist to work with her, someone not accountable, or is accountable, paid by, but doesn't report all the confidential information to corrections. And under that therapy, she started to change immeasurably. But nobody would trust that it was actually real who was working in corrections, because they had a preconceived notion of who she was. And even though she's now doing amazing things, and she's actually one of the advocates that works with this team in one of the prisons, in the prison where she is, every step has been taken, every opportunity has been taken to try and recharacterize her as still an ongoing danger, threat, risk. And so the lawyer who's working with her right now in that, or will be shortly in the parole hearing, has had to dismantle sometimes 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 15-year-old information to try and reconstruct this picture of this woman who her own therapy team, external therapy team, describe as someone who is a leader, who is an Indigenous woman who will lead if provided the opportunity outside, and yet even though the biggest impediment to her actually moving forward is prison, that is the impediment that is going to be most difficult to remove from her. And so I use that as an example, just a top-off example, because one of the challenges also with getting lawyers involved, as we've seen with the segregation cases, is unless you go into the prisons and see what happens, it's very difficult for you to know how you can reform. And so that's part of the reason we encourage all parliamentarians and judges to go in. And as Louise Arbour again has said, she feels that nobody, that pursuant to Section 72 of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, we should all be going in, and that those who are doing this work have no business making recommendations unless they go in there. And part of the reason the lawyers who did the case on segregation didn't recommend no segregation, in my humble opinion, even for women or those with mental health, is they actually didn't believe it was possible, and they didn't understand completely how those prisons work in those contexts. So I just leave you with that there are many, many positive ways we could move forward. And I do agree there are layers, as Howard said, to how we can do it, but I do think judicial oversight is an absolute requirement for that kind of oversight mechanism. So thank you.
Well, that's a wealth of information. Thank you for sharing that with us. And thanks to all four of you for excellent presentations. You've set the scene, and we'll now get on to questions from our colleagues. If we could get some names down here. I see some. Okay, and Senator Joyal, Senator Coyle as well. I just want to, before we go to the first senator, to again remind the observers, the people who are opposite us here, that you can also come to the microphone. Just let Sarah know. We can give you up to 3 minutes for questions or comments. But I need to, as soon as you indicate to her, she'll give me information. We'll weave it in during the course of the next hour. So with that, Senator Deakin to start.
Thank you very much, and thank you all. What a great sort of some diversity and some common messaging. Really, really helpful this morning. The thing I keep wondering about in this whole area is the language I think that you used, Dr. Palmetier, is getting it right. How do we get this right? And one of those, and it's complex as the day is long, and historical and layered and all of those pieces. But when we're looking at perhaps one or two key things in your mind on how we do a better job at our female prisoners or Indigenous prisoners getting access to the programs that they desperately need. And I've heard a lot of the, we've heard a lot of the past today, but as we move forward, what are those one or two things from your perspective are going to help us ensure we get better at the programming piece?
Start with Dr. Palmetier.
Thank you. Well, I think we have to change how we look at everything. Mm-hmm. So, you know, if you just look at the law and you're talking about mandatory minimums, we should have mandatory alternatives. I mean, there's a whole class of offenses that you could have mandatory alternatives, but it's also accountability. What is the result? Where is the accountability mechanism for prisons who don't, where Indigenous women aren't getting access to those programs? Who's accountable? Who's held accountable? What's the price that's paid? It's paid by the Indigenous woman, but it's not paid by any of the institutions. They don't have, zero tolerance policy on excessive use of force and sexual assaults. They're treated like human resource issues or employment discipline as opposed to the crimes that they are. So there really needs to be much stronger accountability mechanisms, and the lack of transparency and access by external people. Systems reinforce systems. We know that. Investigating police, you get the same result every time. And it's no different in corrections. I would argue it's the exact same thing. So I think the focus really has to be on external open transparency and accountability. Someone has to pay the price so that these things are actually enforced.
Sorry. If you have inadequate programs in the community, the last place you should start them is in a prison, because that's exactly what has led to increased numbers of people with mental health issues. The number of people, and this is not, this is not a negative comment on police or necessarily lawyers, but if the only place you can get treatment is in a prison cell, the increasing numbers are, we all know stories of police saying, well, we can't get help for your child, but if you get them charged, they might get access to one of those IRC sentences in the youth system. And so one of the realities is we need to be insisting those resources be in the community. And every plan, including the plans for the regional prisons that now exist, started with the presumption that women would go out to programs into the community, and only where they could not go out, for whether because of their sentence or circumstance, would the community then come into them. Not what has happened, which is now they're mostly developed and administered by staff within the prison, and often as an add-on to their other guard duties or correctional officer duties.
Other comments from Yes.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for the question. I'm going to say something that's just self-evident, so you may think, why am I bothering wasting my time? But this is an interjurisdictional problem. There's a federal, provincial, territorial set of issues, and within those jurisdictions, there are horizontal issues, and so the levels of complexity you point out. But that should not overwhelm us, because in spite of all that, there are some simple things. We've already got it set up in policy and in law that incarceration is supposed to be the last resort. So we have to think about that. And so incarceration is, in fact, an alternative to safe and supportive communities. So everything that we do should really be aimed at not having criminal justice interventions. It cannot be the corrections system's problem to solve in terms of dealing with poverty and mental illness and lack of access to health care and lack of access to addiction support and safe housing and guaranteed incomes. Those aren't criminal justice issues. Those aren't corrections issues. Those things manifest in our prisons in a very, in I think, a very dangerous way. 2/3 of everybody, pretty much 2/3 of everybody who's going to spend a night in a jail or a prison cell in Canada tonight is in a pre-trial or pre-sentence or remand status. So we have defaulted to the use of incarceration to deal with a whole host of issues that incarceration was never designed. And that is frustrating the people that run our prisons and jail systems across this country, because they're not designed to handle those issues either. So it's really maybe another open caucus discussion that's how to make sure that corrections is doing the business of corrections, whatever we say that is, and that we actually pay attention to the policy and the legal frameworks that are suggesting that this is inappropriate. We're incarcerating too many people for the wrong reasons and keeping them there too long.
Thank you.
Dr. Kilty?
Yeah, so I think I just want to point out and sort of echo the comments that have already been made, but this idea of having resources in the community, this is really central. It shouldn't be the correctional system that designs all of the programming, that's doing the mental health care, that's doing health care. I mean, we have services in the community, so rather than splitting our resources up between funding that in the correctional system and then funding that in the community, we need to concentrate on the community and building that up and allowing women that, for example, have been criminalized and women that have not been criminalized to take the same types of programs should they be helpful to them. That was something that I saw a lot doing volunteer work in the nonprofit sector, was that once you have a criminal record, you can only access certain types of programs in the community. You're barred from ones that aren't specifically designed for criminalized people. So again, there's that sort of exclusion. But the more we build community ties, the more that we get programs into the community and have people coming out of prison into the community to do those programs, the stronger their connection to the community is going to be, and they're going to be released eventually, right? So this is how we need to work toward that, rather than having them do everything on the inside, spend 10 years, and then be released with no community connection. That's going to make it much more difficult for them to reintegrate post-incarceration. So building up those kinds of community resources, relying on community people that are not responsible directly to corrections, and that are designing programs without having that, oversight by the correctional system would be really, I think, valuable. And the point that I made earlier about focusing on having women be designated as minimum security, that allows them to have access to these programs more readily, because once you're in max and once you're in seg, that's it. You sit in your cell all day and do nothing. So it's really working within that system as well to sort of, allow women to be classified in a way that makes most sense for them, as opposed to what we think the risks they pose are.
Thank you. Senator Mercer?
Yes, thank you, colleagues. Thank you to all the witnesses for being here. It's always fun to see one of our own colleagues be a witness at the committee. It just demonstrates some of the talent we have around the chamber. My question is really fairly simple. In my work in the inner city and with groups, education has always been the key to ending the cycle. And I know when you have regional community, talking education is also a sensitive issue because of our history of residential schools. But is there a way that we can blend a commitment to solving or helping to solve this problem? Should our commitment not be to providing open and free access to education, that the judges should be sentencing women to high school and to university as opposed to prisons. And the result, the measurement of your success of government intervention into your life is your graduation from high school or your graduation from university, and that's what will change the cycle. Does that work in you people have done the practical work on the ground in the communities where I haven't in many years? Is that part of the answer?
Senator Fate.
I think it absolutely is, and I love that idea. In fact, it reminds me, Yvonne Johnson, who was the first Indigenous woman sentenced to a life sentence for first-degree murder, and that's a whole other story, but we'll do that another when we talk about wrongful convictions. But the first time she ever appeared before a judge, he actually sentenced her to have her teeth fixed because she had a double cleft palate. And it always struck me, I've never seen a judgment since then like that, but the idea that his theory was that one of the challenges she was going to face in life was how to fit in. And I think if you took a similar position of saying, you know, if you go away and finish your education and come back, then you move on. I think when they stop, many people don't know that post-secondary education used to be funded in the federal prison system. It hasn't been since 1992. And so women in particular really benefited from post-secondary education. And last week I was asked to present at a robotics conference. And I won't talk about what they wanted to do with robots in prisons, but what I suggested is they actually work on developing the mechanisms for us to have safe internet access for prisoners. Because when we talk about a lot of these issues, you could also be engaging in education if you can't go to the community. I would underscore exactly what Jennifer just said as well. If you can't go into the community, or even at night when you want to have contact with your loved ones, if you can use the internet the way most of us can to FaceTime or to, email, you could also use it to get hold of the correctional investigator. You could use it to get hold of E-Fry if you're a woman, or the other organizations. You could use it to do post-secondary education. Very few of the women and men, for that matter as well, who want to take, bless you, who want to take education can actually take it because they can't afford it, because the other issue, of course, is how low the wages are. But so, yeah, internet access would be a great thing, and to provide access.
Professor Keelty, please.
Yeah, so as a post-secondary educator, this is something that it's very important. I completely agree with the comment that you made. You know, I think part of the problem is getting access. Part of the problem is funding. University is costing more and more every year. Our tuition goes up. The program that you mentioned when you introduced me is something that we're working on, and it's called the Walls to Bridges program. Shoshana Pollock started it and started running it through the Wilfrid Laurier University and at Grand Valley Institution for Women. And I just finished teaching the first course through the University of Ottawa in the Department of Criminology here at the Ottawa Carleton Detention Centre. So the program is where universities and colleges, the professors get trained and certified. They go into carceral institutions and they teach a course inside there. And the class is made up of half students that come with you from campus, and the other half of the course or class is made up of students that are incarcerated there. This is an extraordinary program. I've been teaching post-secondary for 15 years. This is the best course I've ever taught. It was the most fulfilling course for my students. It was transformative, and it has the potential to also work toward changing the culture inside the institution. You have to have people in the institution championing this. And we saw that as soon as our inside champion actually fell sick a few weeks ago, and as soon as she was absent, our access started to be affected. We were waiting at security for over an hour before, cutting into our class time. So this is something that I think has a lot of potential for both the inside students, the outside students, the professors, the community. It's building that connection. The students that participate in this get university credit. The inside students don't have to pay tuition for that credit. So it's working with the limits that they're going to have. So it's working with the institution, basically just giving us the space for 3 hours a week. So if we can find initiatives like this, and universities are increasingly looking to do these types of things because it's experiential learning opportunities for the university students, this is one way that we can make that happen.
Final words on this question. Senator, not yet, but Dr. Perlmutter.
I'm really glad you raised education, because education is important and it's often looked to as, the solution to a whole lot of things, especially in First Nation communities. I would just caution, however, that education in isolation won't necessarily work. I'm an example of someone who got 4 university degrees, but I wouldn't have been able to even start that had I not had off-reserve Aboriginal housing that allowed me to have subsidized housing, because I was a single mom and I had to raise my kids. And my choice at that time was, I can't afford to go to university unless I have housing, because at the time I was not registered under the Indian Act because of gender discrimination. So I think we really need to think that every time someone comes before a judge, the judge needs to look and say, in what ways has this person been denied their human rights? And in particular, if you look at an Indigenous person, or they denied their fundamental treaty rights to housing, education, and health care, and if so, then Canada needs to be sentenced to complying with their basic human rights and remedying those challenges that brought them here. And then after that's remedied, see if they would actually be before that judge again, because I imagine in the vast majority of cases that wouldn't be the case. Or all of the Indigenous women who didn't get these programs because they didn't qualify under the Indian Act because of current discrimination under the Indian Act. So I think judges need to do more of that innovative stuff and say, what are the challenges this person is facing, primarily human rights breaches, and remedy those first before you look at punishing the individual.
Now the last final word.
The last point, okay. Thank you. Yeah. So, Senator, thank you for that question and bringing education into the conversation. I want to broaden the frame, though, just a little bit. Over the last generation of corrections, we've come to the conclusion that our jails and prisons need to be more depriving, more austere, more harsh environments. They become more punitive structures. And if you look at there's a big disconnect between what we say, how we describe our prisons and jails, and how they actually operate. So for things like program access, we have a wonderful catalog of programs in correctional systems, provinces, and the federal level. What we don't have is great track records of actually delivering those programs and getting lots of people through the programs. And so I would worry about that when thinking about court sentenced, correction system delivered higher education, because of all that. So for me, it's kind of like the lawyers that I talk to that say, look, I'm doing a sentencing submission. Which joint should I ask my guy to be sent to get the best program? And I say, well, like none. And it's not because there aren't pockets of excellent program delivery, but there's pockets of excellent program delivery, and unfortunately. So my hope would be that we recognize that access to secondary for many populations, as well as post-secondary education and vocational preparation, are really important for anybody's success. And that along that pathway that Dr. Perlmutter and others have talked about, which are from communities at risk to prison, somewhere along that pathway there's other intervention points. And so like exit ramps out of the criminal justice system and into those other kind of service providing and supportive systems.
I have one comment. Just that someone made reference to the cost of university going up. I think that what we need to do is compare the cost of university with the cost of incarceration. If you want to make a good case for education, that's probably it. Is compare it with the cost of incarceration, and it's a much better deal to pay for education than it is to pay for prisons.
Entry budget officer in 2010 did that and talked about that you could give Harvard education, use that as the model because it would be international, to Renee, who we were talking about, for the amount that they're going to spend just on, at that time, incarcerating her. The other off-ramp that we made, sorry. No, it's not, but the Youth Criminal Justice Act already shows us a one direction that we could go in, because the Youth Criminal Justice Act provides some of those off-ramps for judges. We were jailing, after the Young Offenders Act, we were jailing kids at 8 times the rate we were jailing adults for a period of time in this country. And when the Youth Criminal Justice Act was introduced, there were a lot of not great things in it, but one of the really good things is judges then had to look at every young person who came before them and decide, are you going to, could this young person have been dealt with in the child welfare, the education, as Senator Mercer has just said, or the health system? And if the answer is yes, then they were basically prohibited from giving a jail sentence. We could do that for adults too.
Material for the Human Rights Committee.
Okay, let's move on to Senator Joyal.
Thank you, and I'm really, I would say, disturbed by the general situation that you described, because finally, Canada has a systemic problem with the Aboriginal population generally. The Chief Justice has stated that Canada has been responsible of cultural genocide, and we have just realized it. It's still not in the mind of everybody. I mean, it has not pervaded the system, and we see from the statistics and the description that you have given us this morning that the fallout of that needs, I should say, drastic changes in the system if we are really to address this issue and the consequences of the residential school system and the general policy and attitude of government in relation to the Aboriginal people. So my first question to you is there anything in the criminal code or in another way or form of initiative that Parliament could take to either amend the code to recognize in the sentencing principle at 718E that you know very well? Is it enough to really trigger the change of approach of the court when sentencing an Aboriginal woman or an Aboriginal person generally? Or should we go a step beyond that and reframe 718E to recognize a set of principles more clearly than what it is now? The Gladue, of course, decision was important, but the Gladue decision came before the publication of the Truth and Reconciliation report, and I think we are a step further. And generally, should we not, in the context of the rights that the Aboriginal people are entitled to be reinstated, should there be a provision that compels the government to act outside what I call the budgetary constraints? And I give an example. The Official Languages Act and the Section 16 and following of the Charter has been tested in court on the argument that some provinces didn't have the money to pay for the official languages minority, to improve the accessibility to the school and give an education of equal value or equal quality. And the Supreme Court has confirmed that the allegation of money is not acceptable not to offer the service. So it seems to me that there is something to be inspired when we come to Aboriginal people. The Canada has the responsibility to reinstate them in their status. So the government cannot claim we don't have the money, or the rehabilitation program is full, or the treatment, is not available. I think there is a need to rethink our principal approach in relation to the Aboriginal people. what is your view of that? Because I think we're still at the beginning of realizing what we have to take as initiative to really address the problem in itself. And of course, you testify on the court system. There are other aspects of the Canadian life that needs to be addressed, but at least we would recognize the principle, the fundamental principle of responsibility of repair. And that responsibility is, in my opinion, constitutional. It is an inescapable responsibility of the government. So what am I...
Okay. All right. Who wants to start? Dr. Palmhutter, would you like to start? Sure. Okay.
Yes. Can you please join our advocacy group? We have been trying to make those same arguments for a long time. It's very complex situation. No one suggests that it's simple in any way. However, it always comes down to a matter of choice. Always comes down to a matter of decisions being made by policymakers, legislators, MPs, senators, bureaucrats, cabinet. It's always a matter of choice. Do we spend $7 billion on the Kinder Morgan pipeline, or do we spend $7 billion on health and education programs in First Nations to make sure that they have access? These are choices that we make every day. And I think it's important. Part of the good thing about Section 718E is that it leaves room for discretion so that you can accommodate individual circumstances. On the other side, part of the problem is the discretion, because the justice and correction system is so infected with racism, historic, ongoing, blatant, individual, and systemic, that discretion, in fact, is consistently used against Indigenous peoples. So while some people, advocate for, more discretion and more flexibility, I think we need to have some more baselines that prescribed activities, mandatory programs, mandatory interventions, mandatory rethinking of what we're doing here, because who's ultimately held accountable? I mean, we can talk about it in Senate committees, and there can be a report, and there's been 1,000 justice committees or justice commissions on, oh, look, there's racism and Indigenous peoples are having this problem. But since Gladue, since Ipeele, there's more Indigenous people incarcerated. So Gladue isn't helping with all of this discretion. We need more mandatory intervention, and I completely agree with you. I think we need to, maybe even start doing some challenges, because if money is no object for the French language, money should be no object for the very lives of Indigenous peoples that Canada created this situation to begin with. It has at least a moral and legal obligation to fix it.
Senator Pate.
There's a paper on the Elizabeth Fry, the Canadian Association website, that Trish Montour did on this very issue, on the fiduciary obligation that Canada owes to Indigenous prisoners. It's never been tested in the courts, as far as I know, on that particular point. But I recommend it to you if you're interested in that, or I can get it off for you. The other thing is mandatory interventions should not be confused, though, with mandatory minimum penalties, which is, because 718(2)E doesn't apply to many people because of the proliferation of mandatory minimum penalties. And so one of the things that at one point was being discussed was using the needs assessments processes, both in terms of assessing before jail in remand populations and after, to really look at those needs, not risks. So if you have someone who is poor and has addictions, then actually address those issues. And that would fit with also Senator Mercer's recommendation. If they are undereducated in the sense that they have potential and would like to do education, then allocating the resources according to those meeting those needs. And so I think there are all kinds of creative ways we could, but I really like that idea. So maybe that's another leadership piece. And I just have to say, one of the reasons that people like me don't like even you calling them the Gladue factor, 718(2)E, because that case is a perfect example of the discrimination that happens, because she is described in the Supreme Court of Canada decision as a jealous wife who went after because she thought her husband was, or common law husband was having an affair. He had just broken into her sister's place, raped her, then come back, taunted her, beat her up. Then she stabbed him as he was going back into try and get at her sister again. Far cry from a jealous husband. And yet I think that case helps to cover up the misogyny and the racism that many Indigenous women know experience, because nobody else would address that. And the only point of law they could take to the Supreme Court of Canada is whether 718(2)E had been applied.
Okay, that's it. All right. I'm going to go to the floor, and three more senators, Coyle, Bernard, and Cordy, coming very quickly. I just want to, I'm just going to take one at this point in time, then I'll take the other two I have a little bit later. But let me start with Alana Finestone, who's from the Native Women's Association of Canada.
Hi there. While we're on the topic of what we call GLADU factors, I just want to really make sure I understand, is it these provisions itself, or is the way that they are applied that's the problem? Because I've heard of parole officers who are not even trained properly about how to apply the test. But I'd be curious to know what the problem is exactly, and if we can unpack that.
Howard? Papers?
Yeah, no, thank you for that, because that is a significant problem. The life history analysis that's done typically in corrections is supposed to, as they apply to Indigenous clients, it's supposed to be mitigating. It's supposed to help you better understand and integrate programs and treatment, et cetera. But in fact, they often become prejudicial in terms of redefining risk. And so the fact is, it's not just since Supreme Court guidance in GLADU that things have gotten worse. You know, we amended the criminal code and it didn't help. We created the Corrections and Conditional Release Act with those Aboriginal specific sections. It didn't help. Things have just continued to pile on. And part of the disconnect is that it is the application, and this is also reflecting the jurisdictional split. So the federal government makes the criminal law, and the Supreme Court of Canada gives guidance, and we have the Federal Corrections and Conditional Release Act. But most people experience corrections through the administration of justice in provinces and territories. And so, and that's very uneven across this country. And so lack of training, and we've done a better job of rolling out how it is we capture information about individual circumstances and life histories. We have not done such a good job on what to do with the analysis of that information, and then how it's shared or not shared, to the point where I have men and women and families saying, I'm not going through that again. I bared my soul and look what happened. I ended up in segregation. I'd rather just, I'll just do my time. So that is really the crux of the challenge right now. I think we could put principles in the criminal law, but we've already got them, and in human rights jurisprudence, we know that standard is undue hardship. Like, you have to meet those obligations already. So what are the barriers? And I think part of it is this jurisdictional question and the application of those principles.
And I think part of it is the intransigence of the system. I mean, Howard, you just, sorry, you're trying to have me not answer, but they're being used against women as well. And so, as Howard said, but, just look at the incredible work you just did in Ontario. And the intransigence of the system is they're not going to implement and follow through on many. You can't say this because you're still working there, but I can. And so there are all kinds of really progressive recommendations that were made that get filtered because the system isn't ready to move there either. And so the intransigence of the system is
Wait.
Thank you very much. Back to the senators. Senator Coyle.
Thank you. Thank you all for your really important presentations today. Kim, it was good to hear from you. I think I've told Kim this, my daughter, who was a law student at one time, said the day that changed her life was the day she was in Kim's class, and she attended the class in a prison in Truro, Nova Scotia, the women's prison. And Pam, we wish we had you back on the East Coast. We miss you. I am the aunt of a murdered Indigenous woman, and she spent a little time incarcerated, not a lot, but this is something very, very important. And as a new senator, I'm really trying to soak up everything you are saying. I'm, like you said, Pam, feel that Indigenous women are such valued resources for their communities and for our country. And, you know, I'm a kind of glass half full person, and I really appreciated your emphasis. I know we're talking about women in prison. We want to keep them out of prison. And so my questions kind of cascade. One is around community-based, you know, urban and perhaps reserve-based or other Indigenous community-based. When we're looking at community-based, looking at the priorities on the prevention side of the community-based, and then the rehabilitation corrections side on the community-based, what would your recommendations be on those two aspects of community-based efforts and investments? Because those are investments, and we talk about investments here in the government. Then we know some people are going to have to go into prisons, and that's one of the things we're here talking about. And Kim, you mentioned that there are models that we look to, and you mentioned Nelson Mandela's after getting out of that horrible prison at Robben Island, that he made a policy decision on releasing those women with children. And we want Canada to be the leader in how we treat women in prisons. I'd like to know a little bit more about other models that we might look to. And then my final question, I know it's a lot of questions, is about Louise Arbour's study. And I should read it. I remember it. We all, as Canadians, remember. I'm curious which recommendations have been implemented, and what are those obstacles out there? And we've been learning a little bit about the messiness, but what are the obstacles, the main ones, preventing the implementation of those very basic and important recommendations?
Okay.
I'm happy to go. Thanks for your question, and I always miss the Maritimes too, and they always hold me accountable for not being there as often as I should be. I know, and it's televised, so it's just going to be worse. It's really important because there is a lot of emphasis and recommendations around community-based. And one of the problems that the judges that I work with have said is people continually come to us, and there is no community-based option because right now they're not even funded for housing and water and basic health and education. And so First Nations especially are feeling this overwhelming burden where they of course want to have all of the community supports. They don't even have the basics, many of them. And so they're placed in this position where more and more focus is on community-based options without the support, without the funding. I mean, basic treaty rights aren't even being acknowledged. So when you're talking about this priority on restitution and part of it has to be towards communities. And some will have the capacity and some won't. Some communities in BC have less than 100 members. Others in Ontario have more than 20,000 members. So we also have to look at the community and where they are as well, and what will work for the community. But without a significant influx, and I know government calls it investments, but they're actual legal obligations. Without the government starting to live up to its legal obligations, which include all of this financial, judges are going to be put in the same spot, because whenever I work with judges, they say, well, I have no alternatives to put them in, and we have a problem with the feeder group. So the police and the racism in police, they keep bringing us all of these cases. If some of them are tied to mandatory minimums, then the judges have no options. So we have to really deal with the funding and supports and human rights and First Nations rights that are being violated here. So communities can do that, because there is a desire for communities to do that.
Howard Sapers.
Thanks. Senator, there's lots of models. There's lots of places to learn. Some of them are here in Canada. British Columbia, for example, has a very impressive mental health support unit now at the Alouette Correctional Center, which is their standalone center for women. And one of the things that's nice about it is that it's very well integrated into how British Columbia Corrections provides healthcare, and how they provide program access, and how they do their release planning. And it's something worth looking at. The mother-child program in British Columbia has been reinvigorated since under court direction. There was a challenge brought when BC canceled its mother-child program, but I think now the program that they have, the model that they have, is something that you won't find in any other province, and I think that's worth looking at. So there's domestic lessons to be learned. There's international lessons to be learned. As Senator Pate mentioned one, New Zealand has a very good approach in terms of dealing with women and communities from an Indigenous framework, from a Maori framework that I think is worth learning from and looking at. We also have a pretty good blueprint, whether you go way back to creating choices or the Arbor report, the Madam Justice Louise Arbor's report into the incidents at P4W. And if you take a look at those documents and think of them as sort of seminal documents to begin the conversation, I think we also have, because these problems are not brand new. So we've also got some things we can go back and remind ourselves of, I think, as well.
Okay. Oh, Dr. Kilty.
I echo what my fellow panelists have sort of started to discuss. And in terms of other models, there are some really interesting things that are done in different Scandinavian countries where they do open prisons. So that allows you to continue to have your day job where you leave the prison to go to work during the day. So it doesn't have the same kind of financial impact. So there are different things that different countries are doing that I think that we can learn from, that being one of them. Something else that we don't have, there's no single substance abuse treatment center in Canada that's family friendly, where women can bring their children, similar to the mother-child program that you're talking about. So if you're a woman suffering from substance abuse, prior to going to incarceration, if you want to get help in that nature, that would be in inpatient care, you have to find somebody to take your children or give them up for care. So that's a huge obstacle for women entering treatment before, and again, that results in them going into the prison system as opposed to getting treatment in the community before it gets to that point. So there's lots of innovative things that we can think of that are being done.
The child care aspect is critical.
Yeah, it is, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me go back to the floor and then I'll come back to the senators. Jared Shook, student at the University of Ottawa.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask a question. I'm also an editorial assistant for the Journal of Prisoners on Prisons at the University of Ottawa, which is basically an academically oriented, peer-reviewed, but prisoner-written journal. And I wanted to share a couple of comments that were made by women who wrote to us in our latest issue, which was essentially asking prisoners to describe the impacts of Stephen Harper's tough-on-crime agenda on their lives. The first is from Rachel Fader and Sherry Payne. It is rare that a guard treats us with respect or dignity. They demean us, lie, make accusations and assumptions, tease us, restrict our choices, belittle us, swear and call us names. For example, guards have made fun of what clothing women wear, our makeup, our weight, and how much junk food we purchase at canteen. The second that I'd like to share with you is from Josephine Peltier, also from Grand Valley Institution for Women. This was a postscript letter that we received from her as part of her contribution to this project. With a lot of things going on, contributing to this collection was a priority to me because Harper's government had really made my life a living hell. Indigenous women continue to be overrepresented in federal penitentiaries today, a deplorable issue that seems to be dismissed or ignored. I'm so tired and afraid that CSE is going to kill me and my death is going to be ruled off as a natural cause from a heart attack or a suicide. I'm afraid to tell anyone in this place how I feel because they are not here to help me. They're here to do their job. 5 days ago, I told the staff and my parole officer that I wanted to kill myself. I received an institutional charge for disrespecting him because he heard me say something else. The system is simply not set up to help people. So my question is, since this speaks so clearly to the toxic culture that exists in federal penitentiaries, how do you dismantle that? And I'm curious to know if the vacancy at the helm of the Correctional Service of Canada might assist in that process. Thanks.
Well, there's a big question. Anybody got a 30-second answer? Who wants? Okay, Dr. Palmander will start.
Thanks for sharing that. I think it's important that we hear the voices of people who are imprisoned. And there's no easy way to deal with the sexist, sexually violent, racist, oppressive culture within both policing and corrections. It's not everyone everywhere, but it's a pretty significant problem. And it's impossible to deal with it in an open, transparent, and accountable way without external review and analysis and monitoring. If the systems are doing it, they just reinforce and defend the systems. And so I think it's long overdue that we've taken a look at corrections, because there are a lot of problems in corrections. You've probably seen in the media recently about numerous corrections officers that are being charged for sexual harassment of the women that they work with, but also sexual assaults on prisoners, and the Elizabeth Fry Society has long called for reviews of those scenarios. So I think it's something we need to do.
This is sort of answering also one of the things that Senator Coyle asked. One of the things that Louise Arbour recommended is that where correctional treatment, and I put that in air quotes, amounts to correctional interference with the integrity of a sentence, that the case should be able to go back to court. And I think there's a lot of room for that mechanism to be used as well in this country, and it hasn't been used, but to be able to basically argue you go back to court. The Justice Department rejected it, again, another policy decision, but that could be one that would be implemented that would address some, not all. But certainly, and using the mechanisms that currently exist to decarcerate, because the policies right now require Aboriginal communities, for instance, to set up mini institutions. They may call them healing lodges, but they basically mandate them to run little prisons or smaller prisons, instead of the type of initiative that was actually intended by the legislation, which would be individualized approaches. And, people could build their own houses, they could have addictions workers, they could be going to school for the money that they're using to build institutions instead.
Merci. Sénatrice Bernard.
Thank you. Thank all of you for your testimony today. Really appreciated hearing from each of you. And thank you, co-chairs, for organizing this. I know time is short, so I won't be able to make all of the comments or ask all of the questions, so I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. I want to start with the book written by Dr. Francis Henry, sociologist from York University, back in the 80s, called Forgotten Canadians, the Blacks of Nova Scotia. And most days of my life, I feel that that's still our reality. Black people are really forgotten in this country, have been neglected in this country. And it's so, the realities, when I think about all of the issues. So I'll just comment on something that was recently in the media about the number of street checks. If you're Black and you're in Halifax, you're 3 times more likely to be stopped. So it's that criminalization of the Black body and the brown body, and similar to the criminalization of the Indigenous bodies and communities. Mm-hmm. And that's part of what accounts for the over-representation. But the level of racism, the systemic anti-Black racism. So if we just take what's happened in this country, on January 30th, the Prime Minister acknowledged the UN-declared decade for people of African descent, acknowledged anti-Black racism in this country, acknowledged that it's time for Canada to do better. And when the time for media questions came, no one asked a question about his statement. And in this budget, for the first time in this country, we have money specifically targeted at African Canadians. First time in the country that this has ever happened. And the backlash the racist backlash has been unbelievable. So when I think about all of those social conditions, and bringing it back, I am going to bring it back to women in prison. So my question, I think we'll start with Mr. Sapers. I remember reading a report that you gave a number of years ago about the significant increase of black prisoners. I think that was largely about black men. And I'm wondering if you were looking at black women at that time. I think you were looking at those years, 2000 to 2015, a significant increase.
Yes, there was a report that was issued by the Office of the Correctional Investigator while I was there. And what we found is that there was a 3 to 4 times overrepresentation rate of black Canadian federal offenders as compared to their participation rate in the community. In fact, I believe it's true today, it certainly was true then, that the second fastest growing subpopulation of federally incarcerated people, right behind Indigenous women, was young black Canadian men. And that continues to be in place. So that overrepresentation has grown. So the demographic shift in Canadian penitentiaries continues along that same track, being more racialized, more marginalized, more Indigenous, more black, and more female. So I don't have a number for the growth of women as opposed to men. Although I believe the Office of the Correctional Investigator has that number, and you could certainly ask them. One of the things that I've just been looking at is the relatively new anti-racism, anti-discrimination strategy that's been rolled out by the province of Ontario, and there is a very specific component that is focused on justice issues, and very specific component of that's focused, or within that anti-racism strategy is a component that's focused on anti-black racism, and I've yet to see anything like that at the federal level. So,
do you think that might be helpful?
Yes, I do think that would be helpful. Thank you. Yes, just to be clear.
For the record.
Yes.
So can I just tag on the question?
Briefly,
okay.
Running out of time.
So one of the things that we've seen is around intersectionality. We've seen mixed race women, Indigenous and African, particularly in the Maritimes, and a number of them have told us that they're choosing their Indigenous identity because they have better access to resources. So basically they're denying a part of who they are. Wondering if any of you could speak to that, what's happening with that, and what recommendations you would have to address that.
Okay.
I would have the same recommendations, that we actually get them out. And in terms of the last numbers I've seen, it's 11% of the women's population are black women. And it used to be mostly in the Maritimes and Quebec, and now it's actually in Ontario. And so so that's the information I have. But I do think, it's atrocious. The intersection of racism, misogyny, and class bias is huge, and so we do need to address that.
As you probably are aware, the Donald Marshall Inquiry in 1999 made a series of recommendations, not just for Mi'kmaq people, but also for Black people that were living in Nova Scotia, and they haven't really done a good job of doing a whole lot of work other than cultural sensitivity training, which hasn't yielded a whole lot of results. That seems to be the go-to recommendation. But I know there are groups like Idle No More and Black Lives Matter in Toronto try to do a lot of work on police accountability, which is the feeder group that puts the law in conflict with people, not the other way around. And I think we just need to kind of build on those alliances as well, because we're sharing the same kinds of issues, and including like things like foster care and poverty and homelessness, especially in areas like Toronto.
Okay. I've got one more senator, but just before the one more senator, Senator Cordy, I've got one more from the floor. Elizabeth Beauchamp, student at Carleton. Got to give equal time to Carleton. We had University of Ottawa, now we got Carleton.
Hi, I'll make this quick because I know we're on a timeline. Thank you so much for having this this open caucus. I think it's really wonderful that the leaders of this country are talking about this really important issue that hasn't really been discussed that much. And so this question is directed primarily towards Dr. Palmater and Senator Pate. I have a few points, so I'll try and go quickly. So what do you think the root of this public issue is? Specifically with that, like what are a majority of these injustices, including incarceration, would continue to occur against Indigenous women and children caused by the beliefs and perceptions that we as Canadians have held historically towards these women? So, for example, with Section 718, where we're working against women within the courts, for this example, and also like the media's influence in our society, how that's really perpetuated by the perceptions that we hold as Canadians. So all of that being connected, I also wanted to ask regarding exploring judicial oversight, what exactly that would look like. I know you had mentioned that, Senator Pate, as well, and regarding the multiple and cascading levels of oversight, what are your thoughts on this, Dr. Palmater, as well? Thank you.
Okay, we'll start with Dr. Palmater and then Senator Kate.
Thanks for that question. One of the biggest issues is that racism actually just reinforces the racism that happens in the institutions. So because of racist laws and policies, Indigenous people and Black people are put in these systems of marginalization, and then the criminal justice system criminalizes their conditions of poverty, which puts them in conflict with the law. And so then once you're in the justice system, it is racist, and the corrections is racist, and so it just continues to perpetuate itself. But so far, there hasn't been any really hardcore recommendations around dealing with the problem of societal and policy and government-based racism. Cultural sensitivity training for police officers doesn't stop them from raping Indigenous women, nor does it stop corrections officers from extorting sex from prisoners for cigarettes. That's not about cultural insensitivity. There's blatant racist and sexist violent crimes that are happening, and they aren't being addressed. So we need to do that. Some of it, if you ask society whether or not they want to deal with it, it's never going to come from a popular vote. Human rights and equality doesn't come from what's popular. It's something that usually has to be top down. And I think we're going to need to start enforcing open and transparent numbers about what's happening and external review and accountability. If we don't put those things in place, we're not going to make a whole lot of change. So for me, it's really about this open access and external review that's going to force the change, because it won't necessarily just come from popular vote in society.
Senator Pate?
And in terms of judicial oversight, I think part of it is judges actually going in and seeing where people are going and having some of the policy types of and legal changes we've talked about, where before a judge makes those sorts of decisions, they have to consider other factors and look at those issues, and possibly the types of principles that Senator Joel was talking about that I think could help guide. So there are a number of ways we could be doing that, but also, I do think the internet access for individuals to be able to themselves, right now, lots of people, it's amazing the number of people who file their own documents by handwriting them meticulously and painfully over, weeks and months. But they could be doing that if it would also be a way to trigger access. And so those are some ideas. But you're a creative young person. I'm an old git now. So, I'm sure you guys have creative ideas too.
Okay. Thank you very much. And
Senatrice Cordy. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You are four extremely strong voices to help people who are imprisoned. And I really like, Dr. Palmater, your comment. They're imprisoned for their socioeconomic conditions that serve as a pipeline to prison. And the four of you are very strong voices. And we talked about reasons why people go in prison and that they shouldn't even be there. And mandatory minimums was raised a few times, and there shouldn't be mandatory minimums.
But there are people in prison, so my question deals with the people who are in prison. And our hope, and I'm on the Human Rights Committee, and the first time I was in a prison was when this committee started the report, and it was an eye-opener for me, and I feel like Canadians should go in to see what's going on, and the type of people who are in prison who shouldn't even be there. It's not the right place for them. But people who are in prison, we should be working at reintegrating them into society so that when they leave prison, they are able to function well within society. My sense in visiting the prisons is that they are set up for failure. We heard from a young woman who spoke about her reintegration program, and she had to go to the community first with a prison employee, and then after that she could go out with a volunteer. But her first trip out had been canceled 3 times already. So she wasn't yet able to go out with a volunteer. So upon release, she's not going to have finished her program. So how is that helpful? We also hope that they receive skills. And, we all hear the story about the people who, we'll send you to this prison because you'll have skills and you'll be trained. Well, what we heard was there was a big focus on getting the GED, and that's extremely important. But once the box was ticked that you got your GED, there seemed to be nothing else. No university programs for most of them, no availability, and not having access to the internet for that reason was certainly a problem. No skills within the system. And in fact, in one prison, it was a men's prison, but they showed us the budget for skills and crafts was there, but the money was not spent. And I can't think of any way to make things work worse than to have 300 people with nothing to do, aside from giving them skills to use upon release, sitting in a cell with nothing to do. I mean, many have mental health challenges before they go in. This just compounds it. So, am I wrong? I hope that I am wrong, but that's what we heard from the prisoners. But shouldn't we be working at successful reintegration? Shouldn't that be a priority for people within the prison system instead of just lock them up and throw away the key?
So, please, Dr. Kilty, please.
No, you're not wrong. I think I've heard similar stories over the years from men and women inside in prisons across the country, both at the provincial and the federal level. They sit in their cells and they have a lot of dead time. If there are no programs, I mean, it's TV watching and dated books if they can get access to books. It's that part of it needs to change, obviously, and I think the idea of trying to have more community involvement rather than relying on corrections to provide these services is something that creating that separation between what corrections does, because the one thing corrections does well is keep people locked up. That's what they do, punish. So, prisons are designed not just to keep people locked up, they're designed to keep us out. And that's also a big problem in terms of this lack of transparency. Canadians don't understand what prisons are actually like. The auditor report that this caucus was called to speak about also identified in terms of services and training that women were receiving less access to Caucuin, which is the federal program to train people to get jobs on the outside, to actually have working skills. And this is something that women have for years had less access to than do men. And a lot of times the types of vocational training that women are given inside is very gendered, teaching them how to sew, teaching them how to cook and cut hair, as opposed to jobs that when they're out, they're either interested in or can have a living wage at. So we need to rethink how programs are designed, because they're designed in very problematically gendered ways. And we definitely need to have a more transparent correctional system, and we definitely need to create a separation between what corrections does and how we serve programs, which should be done in the community by agencies that are not directly tied to corrections.
And one very small thing that we haven't covered yet today is strip searching.
Yes.
And as you heard, many of the women talk about canceling visits with their children, canceling passes, all kinds of things, because women are strip searched way more than men are, even though they have corrections themselves would say they rarely, if ever, find anything more than maybe some tobacco, maybe some money, maybe some jewelry. And so that prohibits. And in 2005, we heard from the president of Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies when she testified. No, it was Amanda George, because she was actually doing a research study, a lawyer from Australia, that in 2005, all the heads of corrections recommended getting all the security heads of the women's prisons in Canada recommended getting rid of strip searching on a routine basis because of the interference and because of the histories of sexual abuse. Was never implemented, though, and it was refused by the Executive Committee of Correctional Service of Canada.
Alors, brièvement, le mot de la fin, M. Sapers, et après Mme Parlementer.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator, I actually hear your question as a reinforcement or an echo of Mr. Shook's point and the student from Carleton as well. And so Professor Kilty talked about transparency and accountability. She didn't mention leadership, which is fundamentally important to all of this. And it's leadership at different levels, because we're talking about some really profound political, cultural, and bureaucratic either impediments or priorities. And the question between what is the purpose of corrections? Why should we hold people in custody? And is it just to separate them from society, or should something else be happening? I mean, that's why I went to criminology school 100 years ago. So we have come to some conclusions that it's not about warehousing people. We have not necessarily translated those conclusions very well, and it varies again by jurisdiction. But you can't address that question as though it's a single question with a single response. And so it is about leadership, it is about accountability, it is about transparency, it is about oversight. And that vigilance is every day, all the time, which is why I talk about a matrix and not saying, well, maybe if we had more court supervision, it would be better. The United States would be an example of how that's not better. Lots of court supervision. But internal, external mechanisms for oversight and accountability, court supervision, and our Supreme Court has done a pretty good job of defining some of the boundaries of where corrections should go and how they should behave. So it's not any one of those things, it's all of those things. But ultimately, I think to get the return on investment, Canadians make a huge investment into jails and prisons, huge. And to get that return on investment, we have to get the leadership in place that's actually going to live those principles that we've already written into the law, and then not be afraid of that transparency and that oversight and correcting problems when we identify them, because we're really good at identifying the problems.
Dr. Parlementer,
just 3 really quick points, because you're raising the issue about people actually being incarcerated. What do we do with the fact that there are people today in prison? How do we deal with that? I think first we shouldn't take for a fact that they need to be there. There are many people that could be decarcerated, and that's one of the recommendations. But for those that are there, and we know that they will be there, we have to address what isn't happening, and it's the kind of holistic approach to people in prison, so that they're getting the therapy for their mental health needs or trauma, their medicine. Many of them don't even get their medicine or on time, which causes further problems. All of the education and programs, but also access to family. And because we're talking about women in prison, if you don't do all of those things, you're setting up a formula for problem. And then my last really quick point is, we've always focused on women getting out of prison and being able to function in society. Well, part of the problem for Indigenous and Black women is that society doesn't function with them. And we haven't put enough emphasis on dealing with societal, institutional, and government-based racism that keeps putting them in these situations that they shouldn't be in.
Agreed.
Merci. Avant de laisser la parole au sénateur Eagleton, j'aimerais remercier bien sûr les panélistes et aussi l'auditoire, les sénateurs. Nous avons reçu des questions fort pertinente. Et manifestement, il y a beaucoup de sujets d'inspiration pour le comité sur les droits de la personne du Sénat. En introduisant, j'ai souhaité que notre conversation ne se termine pas maintenant. Et je pense que pour la suite, il faut garder espoir et donner tout notre appui aux membres du comité des droits de la personne et espérer que les témoins provenant du public et provenant des milieux experts sauront contribuer largement à cet enjeu de société qui maintenant ne peut plus demeurer un enjeu théorique au niveau des discours. Alors merci beaucoup à tous. Senator Eagleton.
Well, I come into this meeting knowing that there were things that needed to be changed, reforms that were needed. I go away believing there's so much more. This has been very informative, and I really do appreciate the contribution that all four of you made, and my colleagues as well as those who've joined us in the audience. And with that, the meeting now stands adjourned.